I'm Jordan Swain Fox, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, or CURA, at The Ohio State University. And we're really glad to have you here for the fourth and final webinar in the series, Responding to the Housing Crisis, Identifying Challenges, and Seeking Solutions. This series has been co-sponsored by CURA and the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. And throughout the series, we've been hearing from experts on key factors and considerations for the housing crisis in Ohio and beyond. Today's group of esteemed panelists will discuss their work and important developments in housing in Central Ohio. Before we get started in introducing our speakers, I just want to mention a few logistical items. If you require closed captioning today, you'll find a box at the bottom of the screen labeled with CC. You can click this box and select Show Subtitles, and this will allow you to view subtitles during the presentation. We also encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box. We'll ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of this event. And if we don't get to your question, apologies in advance. You'll notice that the chat's been disabled, so use that Q&A function if you have any information you want to share with the event organizers. As you may have seen on our website, this event is approved for 1 AICP CM credit. And to claim your CM credits, log on to your My APA account on the APA website and enter the event into your online CM event log. At the end of the webinar, you'll see a survey pop up in your browser. And if you have the time, we'd love for you to complete this so you can provide your feedback and help us improve these events. If you have any additional questions after the webinar today, you can email me at swaim-fox.1@osu.edu, and I'll put that in the chat. To learn more about CURA's future events or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, you can visit cura.osu.edu. You can also like CURA on Facebook and follow us on X and Instagram. And you can learn more about MORPC's work and their many upcoming events at morpc.org. With that, I'll pass it over to MORPC's Director of Data Analytics and Strategy, Dave Dixon, to introduce our speakers and kick us off today.
Jordan, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending today. I'm very excited about the panel that we have here. We've assembled local experts on housing, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So let's jump right into introductions. We have Carlie Boos, who is the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. In her role, she provides leadership and strategic direction to members, stakeholders, and the local community to expand affordable housing resources. Previously, Carlie was Community and Economic Development Counsel at the Legal Aid Society of Columbus, where she oversaw comprehensive legal, logistical, and financial counsel to organizations that make an impact in Columbus neighborhoods. She also has extensive experience in policy and program development from her time serving at the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. We're also happy to welcome Lark Mallory. Lark is the founder and CEO of Mallory Economic Development Advisors, LLC. Prior to developing her own practice, Lark was president and chief executive officer of the Affordable Housing Trust for Columbus and Franklin County, an organization that provides low interest rate loans to developers of affordable housing. Previously, she was a law partner who served the needs of businesses, individuals, and business owners with regard to transactions involving corporate and business law, taxation, financing, and commercial real estate. Lark, we also have with us today Jason Reece. Jason is an associate professor of city and regional planning at the Knowlton School and vice provost for urban research and community engagement in the Office of Academic Affairs. His research seeks to understand the role of planning in fostering a built and social environment which supports a just city and healthy communities. He is a community engaged scholar, collaborating directly with local community leaders in co-creating knowledge that serves our community. And last, but certainly not least, we have Amy Riegel. Amy was selected to serve as COHHIO's executive director in June of 2022. After serving as senior director of housing for managed care organization CareSource, where she initiated and led the deployment of a $50 million strategic investments in affordable housing across multiple states and helped to launch and replicate Healthy Beginnings at Home, a nationally recognized research study looking at the relationship between housing stability and healthy birth outcomes. Amy is an accomplished housing advocate with over 15 years of experience working with nonprofits and governmental entities, including the City of Dayton, where she provided policy leadership and designed programs in the areas of housing development, asset-based community development, community engagement, education, and homelessness. Thank you all so much for being here. I don't know if we're able to give them a virtual round of applause, but I'm so excited to have you here and jump into this conversation. So we're talking today about housing in Central Ohio. We're going to do a little bit of level setting. For those that have attended the webinars to this point, we've talked a lot about challenges in housing. And so once we collect folks' well-informed opinions and thoughts on kind of what the challenges are, we want to focus on opportunities, next steps, looking ahead, and try to have that solution-focused conversation. Hopefully also sharing, what do we need from each other, from folks who are watching, from our partners to grow better as we get bigger. So we're going to have a handful of questions here. We will have time, I think Jordan mentioned, for Q&A from the audience at the end. You should have a Q&A feature to do that. But until then, we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first prompt I have here is, if you could please describe your work in housing and what you see as the biggest housing challenges facing Central Ohio.
You guys want a Rochambeau for who goes first? I'll kick off. So I'm Carlie. I'm with the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. We're a small group. We're a two-man crew, but we're also membership-based. So we're able to pull in the expertise of 40 different organizations from across the region. And those members are invitation only. And we're very selective to curate a set of experts who know every piece of the housing system. So those who are active in homelessness and shelter, those who work in construction and building and development, those who are in philanthropy and financing, service providers, because when we make recommendations and when we conduct analysis, we want to make sure that we're looking at the system as a whole and not accidentally becoming an industry advocate for a part of the system. We're really here to serve the community. So what our day-to-day work looks like is lots and lots of research and data analysis. We really think to be able to solve the problem, we got to understand it and see how it's shaping and changing. We do a lot of community education. So it's great for us to have a report that's sitting on a shelf, but if we don't get out and talk about it and start working from the same playbook, it doesn't matter. We love technical assistance. So if there's somebody out there who has a housing idea and you just need a free staffer to help you move it forward, we do that. But I think at the end of the day, the biggest role that we provide, even if it's the smallest part of our time, is to be advocates and to be out and vocal and saying that there is consensus here, that we can get 40 people with 40 different perspectives to agree, and that if we do these recommendations, that this is a problem that's entirely solvable.
So I'll go next. Thank you, Carlie, for getting us started. I think we were all just kind of looking at each other. So as Dave said, I recently ventured out on my own, started Mallory Economic Development Advisors, and I provide consulting service. And I'm sorry, I have a little cold, so I have a cough drop too, but I provide consulting services to nonprofits, to developers and governmental entities on how to move the housing needle forward. So some of those services may include putting together a capital stack. Nothing gets done if there's no money to do it. But how do we put together a capital stack to bring units online? What kind of issues do we need to solve to bring units online? I'm a part of the recently announced Regional Housing Coalition, or at least the outcome or what our next steps are. That's an effort that's been going on for the last few years. There were 3 conveners, started with Mayor Ginther, myself, and Kenny McDonald. We divvied it up between 4 task forces. Carlie with AHACO led one of those. And now that we have that data, how do we move the needle forward? Like Carlie said, we don't want just something else to sit on the shelf, and we continue to talk about this, but how do we bring units online to help our neighbors? So that's what I do. Challenges, biggest housing, there are so many, but each challenge gives us a new opportunity. What I am excited about is that we're now all focused on it. Those of us who have been in this space, we knew we had issues a long time ago, but now everyone knows that we do, and everyone is focused on solutions, and that's really what makes me excited.
Thank you, Amy.
Yes. Hi, I'm Amy Riegel. I'm the Executive Director at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, otherwise known as COHHIO. And we're a statewide organization that provides advocacy and technical assistance focused on expanding affordable housing units and finding solutions to end homelessness. Our work is focused on the most vulnerable individuals within our communities, so those who are extremely low income, those with special needs, and those who experience homelessness. We are an organization that coalesces not around necessarily a business interest or a economic pursuit within the housing industry, but more to lift the voices of those who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. And so as we look across the state of Ohio, we try to understand the needs of every nook and cranny of the state, but we obviously are spending a lot of time right now talking about Central Ohio and the diversity of just the Central Ohio region and the needs that must be brought to bear to help the heart of Ohio to really thrive. And so as we look at the challenges, one of the areas that we are most focused on, unfortunately, there are a lot of challenges that we are poised to address, but from our perspective, it really is about affordability. And the fact that in Ohio, and specifically in Central Ohio, that extremely low income individuals, 75% of them are paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And so what that means is the federal programs, 1 in 4 individuals receives federal housing assistance, like a Section 8 voucher or public housing. So that's 25%. Those are the only individuals living. We have no naturally occurring affordable housing in Central Ohio. And that is a great concern because the government can't do it alone. So that is what we're really looking to tackle right now.
Thank you very much. And Jason?
Yeah, I think more recently, my work's been in 3 different domains. First, looking and advising in regards to land use policy, which is really critical to our underproduction issue that we have here in Central Ohio. Second is I myself, from the development side, I sit as the board director for a very small nonprofit that works on the South Side. Can share with you the ups and downs of trying to build affordable housing in that context. And then finally, I'm the the evaluation director for Families Flourish, which is a program that really focuses in on trying to help working families who are housing unstable. If we provide them that housing stability, how do we set them up long term to be able to be in a place where they can navigate the housing market without subsidy in the future. From a research perspective, my work kind of focuses on, I think, just the overwhelming, the significant impacts of housing instability, particularly on physical and mental health. Yeah, I mean, I think about kind of, not to reiterate what we've already talked about here in this discussion, but, when I think about our challenges, undergirding all of that is our lack of production, which is really driven by our land use policies. also recognizing, and this really kind of speaks from experience with Families Flourish, to recognize that housing instability is one part, looking at, the bricks and sticks, and can we get people in units that are stable and safe and affordable. The other part of that is helping folks navigate a housing market that's incredibly challenging if you're lower income, if your income is not is in any way erratic, if you've got a eviction on your record, and so you're recognizing that we have a whole array of other barriers that keep people in unstable housing.
Thank you very much, Jason. And so, what I'm hearing here is comments about looking at the system, right? And we have different stakeholders with different roles and parts of that. We have all of us coming together here. We have new initiatives to try to make sure we have all the right folks at the table. And the concerns, we've got affordability concern. I think, I had a sub question here. What do we hear when we talk to the community? I know from surveys, we certainly hear that. That directly connects to the instability, that directly connects to our concerns of the most vulnerable, right? So looking at that, I'm kind of priming the pump here a little bit. When we look towards opportunities, if we're going to increase supply, and we're going to try to increase supply in a way that's equitable, that closes gaps at the same time. When we think about the land use policies we have in place, we think about the jobs of today and the jobs that are coming. How do we do that? What do you see as the opportunities? We talk a lot about, growth as an opportunity. We could be on a declining trajectory, but we're projecting more jobs, more households, right? So as we grow, what do you see as the opportunities, either from your desk or working collaboratively together to make that happen, right? To bring that additional supply and provide the housing options that residents need and deserve.
I mean, also just kind of at a human perspective, what I hear is when I go out into the world, nobody sits down at the dining room table and talks about supply and demand. That's not what the family vocabulary is. They talk about, well, property taxes are going up and I don't know how I'm going to deal with it. And similarly, no one talks about zoning reform and modernization. They say, I've been paying my mortgage for 20 some years, and now the government's telling me I'm not allowed to build an in-law suite to help my mom move in. I mean, all of these are housing policy issues that we really academic guys, but normal folks are talking about them. They're just using different language. I think when it comes back to addressing that supply gap and getting more homes to the people who need them, in Columbus in particular, Zone In has been an incredibly strong start. So our zoning laws here in the city are baked in the 1950s. That's when they were last comprehensively updated. So that's pre-civil rights, it's pre-women's rights. And for all of those challenges, even at that time, it was built to solve problems of the 1950s. And that's not what we've got today. Last year, the city did begin that update process, and it's going to take time because it's a long code. It covers a lot of land, but the first 4% of parcels are now in the new code. And it's going to go from helping us build about 6,000 homes on those 4 parcels to about 80,000 homes, which is fantastic. And it's the most transit-oriented, equitable zoning code in the country for that 4% of parcels now. We got 96% of parcels we still need to do. There's a lot more of that code that needs to be updated, but we're on the right track. And I think that's one of the things for 2025 that I'm really excited to see where it goes next.
I will say, and Carlie raises a really good point about what we're doing in Columbus. There are times when I'm discouraged as what we're doing in a region. And we just saw news releases about what just happened in Marysville. So now we know that multifamily is not considered a permitted use when you're talking about mixed use development. As great of a job as we're doing in the city of Columbus, so whether it's zoning, whether it's really moving Link Us forward, we need the entire region at the table. And if you say that multifamily is not part of permitted use as part of mixed income, or I'm sorry, mixed use, then I don't know what mixed use is. If multifamily isn't included, I literally don't know what mixed use is. I'd like to see is, I think we have a lot of opportunities in front of us. And again, talking about the Regional Housing Coalition, but we've all got to be committed to moving housing forward. We can't put everyone in the city of Columbus or in Franklin County. And unfortunately, it seems as though we have some hurdles that we still have to overcome with that mentality that it's someone else's problem. A lot of momentum, but we're still facing some challenges.
And to Lark's point, the Central Ohio is so diverse. And so when you talk about words like multifamily, or you say words like density, people think that we're speaking code for urbanizing all of Central Ohio, making it all look like downtown Columbus. And that can be really scary if you don't live in downtown Columbus or you don't live in the short north. Thinking about that level of density can kind of be like, but that's not where I live. That's not what I moved into. And so really helping people understand that when we talk about increasing density or when we talk about multifamily, it doesn't have to be a 20-story apartment building, that it could be a double or a duplex house that has a single front door that looks like a single family home from the front, from the street of that home. Or it could be a small 4-unit type building. That there is this, and I know Carlie talks about this all the time, this gentle density that we can look at across the region that would really have a significant impact, whether that's with ADUs, whether that's with smaller unit housing complexes that also are diversified then in the income levels that can be accommodated in those housing units. Because when the only thing that we're building is either 300 units of income limited housing or 300 units of home starting at $350,000, you're not getting any type of income diversity and integration that is what the businesses really need when they look to hire and to build their economic value within the region.
Let me add something to that. Reality is we either have density, so whether we want to say gentle density, but we're either going to have some density in places where it makes sense. So going back to the Marysville example, if it is a mixed use development, that's where multifamily makes sense. So we're either going to have density or we won't have green space. You can't say, well, I don't want density and preserve my green space in a period of growth. It's one or the other. And as a region, we need to decide whether it's gentle density, because duplexes don't solve everything. Not with the type of growth we have to deal with. And not with the underbuilding that we've been doing. But it's either density where it makes sense, such as a mixed use development, or give up green space. It's one or the other.
And I would add to that, if we talk about zoning reforms, if you look at Minneapolis, which was the first major city to go through this process, despite the claims by opposition, the sky did not fall in Minneapolis when they rezoned everything, right? Yes, you're seeing more production in the market, which is exactly what you want, but you're not seeing neighborhoods overtaken by 6-story apartment buildings placed randomly. These things are always going to align themselves with the infrastructure that makes sense.
Right.
And recognize too that, to do redevelopment in this context, it also has to, you have to have a pro forma that works out. And so there are certain limits and constraints that kind of produce, will keep us from avoiding some of those kind of nightmare scenarios that people imagine in this context.
And I think when we talk about zoning reform too, it's important to acknowledge there's two completely different purposes behind why we want modernization. First of it is what Lark is talking about. We don't have enough homes and we need to find a way to build more homes. And that's a function of affordability and sufficiency and quality of life. But there's also a completely separate function, which is choice. And right now, if I want to buy a single family home, I can. That we are building them. We have built them since the 1950s. That's been basically the only thing we've built at scale. If I want to buy a duplex, I want to buy a triplex, I want to buy a accessory dwelling unit, I can't do that because the government has said that's not what we want you to build. We're going to shift our laws to make that functionally impossible for the market to create. And that's not just in kind of that home buying, home purchase. We've kind of put our thumb on the policy scale in different ways too. So another thing that we hear a lot is churches feel that they can't use their land that they own in ways that they believe are necessary to cater to their flock, right? They've got a lot of senior members who need senior affordable housing. They've got an empty parking lot that they are prohibited from turning into what they need to carry out their mission and to execute their faith. And then again, from like a neighborhood development standpoint, one of the things that we did great in the 1970s was strip malls. Shoot, we layered the map with strip malls. So now we've got all of this business space and no customers. What does it look like to put a story of apartments or townhomes on top of these obsolete strip malls? That's really re-energizing for the small business sector, for the commercial corridors. Again, this isn't exclusively about affordable housing. It's about choice and neighborhood sufficiency.
Carlie, that's a wonderful point. Dave, I'm sorry, and I'm going to actually dovetail into a different question. But Carlie raises a good point about choice. So I'm a divorced mom. Both of my kids are finishing up college. I live in a house that I don't even know if it made sense when the kids were little because it was probably too much space, but I don't have options. So we're dealing with a couple of different things now. One, if I want to downsize, and I want to downsize into a smaller single family home, or I want to downsize into maybe a townhouse or row house or brownstone, whatever word you want to use, I don't have an option. And it contributes to other issues. You know, I'd love for my kids to come home to Ohio. I heard a congressman say that grandchildren are the reward for not killing your kids as teenagers. I want to see my grandchildren. I'd love for them to be able to come here. We know that childcare costs are rising. We also know that grandparents help with the care of grandchildren. But if we've done such a good job of keeping people out, we kept our own kids out. So to Carlie's point, if there's a choice to be made, maybe I want an ADU where one of my kids in their family, his or her family, can move into the house and I move into the ADU, but we don't have choice. And Carlie, I think that's a really good point. And because we don't have choice, people like me are in houses that another family could probably make a much better use of. I can downsize or something, but we've done away with choice. Carlie, good point.
I appreciate several aspects of where the conversation is going, especially as I think we've just kind of dived into how housing is so critical to quality of life and our experience as residents, and what this means for the next generation, right? We are talking about the future. How do we handle this? And whether that next generation is our children, current residents of those moving to the region. You know, we project that up to 3/4 of our growth through 2050 may come from immigration from around the state of Ohio, around the country, and around the world, right? And everyone needs to live somewhere, and everyone has a circumstance. And we talked about choice. So providing that choice, you know, whether you are a highly paid electrical engineer in manufacturing, or you are working class and you need something else to be able to have that quality of life here in Central Ohio. The other thing, which goes into where we're headed with the question set, is as you talked about solutions and opportunities, things you're excited about, things you'd like to see more of, other in more locations and more places around the region. I was thinking of places where those things do exist, cities, neighborhoods, in the U.S. context, in the European context, lots of things kind of flashing through when we talk about that mixed use, when we talk about options for different types of units. So let's zoom out a little bit. We're not the only place with housing challenges. So when you think about other big cities around the country or elsewhere, and steps they have taken that would make sense in the Central Ohio context, what are some things you see out there that you hope we can emulate or we can learn from?
I think that one of the issues that we have seen addressed in a more comprehensive way across the country, especially in other large, fast-growing communities. So if you look at the US list of the fastest growing communities in America, you'll see all these random cities on there that you've never heard of, and it's because their population is going from 10,000 to 40,000, which is great for them. But it's not comparable to the growth that Central Ohio or Columbus is about to go through or is going through currently. So if we look at other communities that are a little bit comparable to Columbus, what we see, one of the issues that we're really looking at is that in a lot of those communities, rent has started to decrease in those communities. So this year, Raleigh-Durham, Nashville, Austin, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, cities that have experienced high growth or who are comparable to Columbus, they've all seen decreases in their rent over this last year. Columbus has seen a 6.1% increase in rent in the last year. And it continues to go up, along with Cincinnati and Cleveland also seeing these levels of increases. Cleveland is actually one of the highest in the country. And so as we think about that, and we then even look at raw numbers, people are always like, but Ohio's so affordable. It's one of the most affordable places in the country. But the truth is, when we look at rent, Columbus rent is actually higher than almost every city on that list that I just mentioned, except for Phoenix and except for Austin, where it is only less than $100 more in those cities than it is in Columbus. So we will quickly exceed them very soon. And so many of those communities took efforts to make sure that rent was well paced with the growth of the community and that affordable units were maintained. So doing a lot of work to really protect the affordability of units, to preserve affordable units, and to hold landlords and property owners accountable for the units that they're providing and the rent that they're charging. In Ohio, we actually have gone in the opposite direction of taking more rights away from tenants, putting more protections around landlords to exploit their tenants, and to allow it for more ease for investors, especially large out-of-state institutional investors, to come buy up properties and drain all the resources out of them. So I think that we have to take a real community approach at protecting the people who live here. And I believe at the same time, if we did that, that we'd actually see higher property values and more investment within our communities.
Amy, let me ask you one follow-up on that. So you just recommended a community-driven approach to change that dynamic, right? That's something systemic that's been happening for a while. Do you see roles at other levels? You know, we talk about the county level, the statewide level, legislative action. You know, I'm going to just open it up. What would you like to see? What type of action would you like to see on that front that you think's in the realm of possibility? As we mentioned, so many folks are focused on housing right now, right? That's in my mind a real opportunity and focused on solutions at this point, right? So I think we've all agreed that we need to do something. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that the preservation of affordable housing, so where you have affordable housing units, making sure those units stay within good hands within the communities, that they're well maintained, and that there is resources available to help them think about the future and how they're going to plan and build for the future of those units being available for a long period of time. That I think is very important. Now, the topic that really scares people is when we talk about rent stabilization, not rent control. Rent control has been shown to not be effective, but rent stabilization has. Many communities could take an approach to rent stabilization. However, the State General Assembly has blocked rent stabilization efforts by cities across the state. And so I think if cities really want to be able to address their needs, they have to have the control to be able to do that. And so we can't have, an oversight organization telling communities that when something is needed to stem the tide, that they aren't able to take the actions that they need.
I mean, if I can go hyper local too on things that we can do to strengthen the system in the very short run. So things that are on the radar today. Councilmember Favor has been chair of the Housing Committee in Columbus City Council. She's about to graduate up to the Franklin County Prosecutor. I think that's fantastic for her. But in the final days of her term there, she's really interested in advancing an access to counsel ordinance, one that would say that if you are a parent and you are facing eviction, that is a life-altering outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is necessary, let's make sure it's necessary by making sure you have an attorney who can represent your rights. As limited as those tenants' rights are in Ohio compared to other states, having legal counsel make sure that they are enforced and that due process is upheld. That's a huge thing to come out and say that we are going to use the limited budget that we have at the municipal level to make sure that people have the right to an attorney in these situations. It's fantastic. I do think, though, it's incumbent upon all of us as people who give a damn to stand up and say, yep, I agree, let's do it and let's move it forward, because just because the idea has been proposed doesn't mean that you can't show up and show support. You really need to kind of rally the crowds to say that this is something that's worth doing here.
I guess I would add, thinking about that state level, we had a collaborative housing policy course out of my program that I taught with 7 other universities, very different housing markets. And, you have to really think about the legal context at the state level is really critical. Yeah, it's great to look at California and they do some amazing stuff, but they're not a home rule state like we are, right? Boston has done some amazing things with their kind of no snob policies that date back half a century. Maybe we could try something like that here. So it's really thinking about that state level. As a home rule state, local governments have tremendous autonomy over what can get built in their communities. And so I do think, and I think it's a bipartisan issue. We need housing. We need housing production. If our economy is going to continue to grow, and we're going to, fight back on the history or legacy of being in the Rust Belt, we need production. And that means, maybe at the state level, we do need to start thinking about how to assure that communities are not blocking housing production, not really incurring self-inflicted wounds in that way through their land use policies.
Yeah, thinking about what some other communities have done, one community that's not talked about a lot, at least in my opinion, is Atlanta. Atlanta took a regional approach to their housing issue. So when you talk about Atlanta, you're not just talking about the city, you're talking about the entire region. And one of the very first things they did, and I think it's so simple, but no one talks about it, is the governmental entities took an audit or did an audit of their own properties to see which properties they own that could be developed. It's one thing if you already own the property, you already can drive it forward versus trying to acquire it. I am excited to say, and I don't think it's out there, but we are looking at doing something like that in Central Ohio. It's just starting with governmental entities, do an audit of your own properties. What can you build? We've talked about zone-in, and what we haven't talked a lot about is Link Us. In our effort to focus more on public transportation. I know we talked about gentle density, but the reality, we just can't grow the way we've always grown. We can't keep putting more cars on the street, building more roads. We've got to be smarter about that too. With Link Us and what was recently passed in November with the Central Ohio taxpayer is we're now looking at bus rapid transit. And how do we develop along those corridors as well? I like to say that we're being smarter about it. We're not being as haphazard and building developments that are, 30 minutes away. We talk about Intel, and we're all excited about Intel, but we don't talk about the fact that a lot of those workers will only make $40,000 a year. And $40,000 a year is not even our area median income. So those folks are going to need some type of subsidy in housing in order to be able to afford to live. And so there are so many issues. We've got to talk about, I say build, baby, build. Build whatever you can build, wherever you can build it, at whatever price point. Because part of the issue with affordability is we just need more units. I mean, there are also the market conditions. If you know there aren't enough units, then you can charge more. So we've got to start looking, and I'm excited to say that we are looking at it more holistically in addressing all of the different issues that come together with housing. But Atlanta they started with just a survey, and I think we can do that.
Very good. So thank you for that, everyone. And so where I want to take this next is as we think about the options, we think about the solutions, the things we know we need to do, the things we'd like to do, the things that we maybe know work from other areas. And consider those who are most heavily impacted by the housing crisis, negatively impacted. When we have those folks who are below AMI, those folks who are housing unstable for whatever reason, or the kids that want to stay close to home, they grew up in Central Ohio and they want to stay here while they have that first job. So whoever it is that we have in mind, we think we really need to help them. We need to make sure we do this right. How does that affect our prioritization? Because there's a lot of things we could do. There's a lot of things we discuss. When we think of like a triage, right? Like who's most vulnerable? You know, right now we have survey data on this from the public. We know that households up to $100,000, earning up to $100,000 a year are feeling the pinch somewhat here in Central Ohio. That's our 15 counties, right? And that's an eye-opening number. When you look down at households making, 50, 35, as you can imagine, the strain and the challenges get bigger and get harder as you go down in income. So I think about these families a lot, and what I want to ask you is, as we're doing this, yes, we want to build. We need a lot more supply. How do we make sure we proceed in a way that we are taking care of these folks first?
So I think about this a lot too. And I think that where my initial thought goes is that prioritization is not the right word, because it creates this false dichotomy of you have to do things one at a time sequentially. We got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And when you talk about someone earning $115,000 a year and they can't afford their housing costs, that's bull. I mean, yeah, it's true. It is the correct analysis of the situation, but those households don't need subsidy in the abstract. That's where supply and demand should just take off and run. So we got to build so that we are not focused on those upper middle income categories. That's where construction is most appropriate. We also need to look at pathways to economic self-sufficiency. So you got a minimum wage worker who's just killer at their job, but they're tapped out of how far they can go up that career ladder. How can we use housing as the foundation to get them a better education so that they can get into a job where they earn more and they can be that $115,000 earner? And then there's the reality that there are some folks who are not able to earn more money. They might have a disability, they might be retired, they might be literal babies. We're not going to put them into the workforce, and they should still have a safe home. For that incredibly small sect of people, that's where you look at subsidy and things like the housing choice voucher. And it should always be a small part of our population, but it's just this acknowledgement that I can be Oprah Winfrey, right? You get a free house, you get a free, you get. And there are some people who will not be able to afford the property taxes and the insurance and the maintenance. And we cannot let them die because that's how the market is set up. That is the definition of a failed market, something that is necessary for survival, and a small percentage of people will never be able to afford it. That's where government intervention is the definition of our market.
So similar to a program that Jason talked about at the beginning, there was a pilot program in Columbus called Healthy Beginnings at Home. And the original 100 women came from the Franklin County area, mainly in the neighborhoods with the highest rates of infant mortality. And in this program, women had to be on Medicaid, pregnant, and they had to be facing housing instability. So most of them were nearing eviction or were literally homeless. And so as the women entered the program, there were very, very few things that could keep them from being in the program. And it was if they had been evicted from public housing for only manufacturing of drugs or arson. And the other thing was they couldn't have more than $1,500 in utility debt. And we thought that was fairly reasonable because most of the women entering the program were only 24 years old. However, the greatest reason that women were turned away was because they either had more than 6 evictions or they had more than $1,500 in utility debt. 24 years old. And so when we think about housing and we think about supply and we think about the growth within our communities, we also have to go back and look at the roots of what is keeping people from finding stable housing and being able to maintain that housing. In the state of Ohio, we do not have just cause or cure periods for eviction. And what that means is that a person can be evicted because they were $10 short on their rent and they didn't have a chance because they wrote the wrong numbers on their, Venmo transfer, however they're paying their rent these days. And they also can just get evicted for no reason other than that the landlord wants them to leave. They have to give them notice, but they can get evicted at any time because the landlord wants them out. So if the system is set up that easy to provide this mark, how much can we really hold that mark against a person for the perpetuity of their life? Because unlike a bankruptcy, eviction never goes away. Or if you committed a crime when you were 18 years old, is that still being used against you when you're 42 years old and looking for a unit? So we do have barriers that make it very difficult, but these aren't barriers that have to be there. They're barriers that we choose to put in place, and we can choose to take them away. And I think now is a time that we really, as communities, have to really pressure and speak loudly to say these have to be taken away.
And, one thing we haven't discussed is, and Carlie, you hit on income a little, but let's talk about the developers. I tend to be on the business to business side of things, so not as much interaction with end users. But what we know is that developers, architects, construction folks, that's one way of building wealth. And we've created a system where only certain people can advance in these positions. So if we're going to talk about growth and we're going to talk about equity, I want to talk about equity on the side of who the developers are, who the contractors are, who the architects are, who the rental agents are, who the managers are. Let's talk about equity in all of those roles, because what we also know is that Columbus, Ohio is one of the most racially segregated economic cities in the entire country. And that doesn't change if people aren't allowed to get in the game. So we can't just I don't want to say we can't, but I don't want us to just focus on end users when we know that to be a Black woman in development or in finance or as a lawyer, it's hard. It's hard. We've got to create pathways. And even with home ownership, a home is still how you build wealth. That's the foundation for building wealth. And there continues to be a huge racial wealth gap. We're not talking about those issues.
Yeah.
I would just say too, though, I thumbs up vote for everything you said, but also when you have a developer community that looks like your neighborhoods, it does serve the end user. If you're a Black woman, you're going to build for your Black women tenants. If you are from the South Side, you're going to build for the needs of the South Side. There is a qualitative and quantitative to here too.
Absolutely agree. And you're going to hire people from the neighborhood. So to your point, we're increasing wages, increasing opportunities so that we can move people up the wealth, or start to decrease the wealth gap and move them up in economic stability.
Yep.
I agree.
And when you go out
Yeah.
and spend that developer fee, I'd rather you spend it at Wendy's, which is born here in Columbus, than at,
Right.
I can't even think, In-N-Out Burger.
But we need to address those issues as well when we're talking about housing.
Thank you all for that. This is really great. I wish we could keep you all day jealously for myself. I love to respect the Q&A time for folks who have been entering those and make sure we get to those. Before I hand it back to Jordan, because we flowed right into this, I do want to work in one question from the MORPC team, which I think is kind of a meta fundamental type of question, which is a follow-up from the session we had a few weeks ago with Chuck Marone. And that is, some see there's a fundamental paradox in our housing system where housing is necessary shelter for everyone, and therefore we cannot allow the values to rise too much, right? Otherwise it won't be affordable. And the other is that housing has become a fundamental mechanism for building wealth, and therefore we want values to rise. So when we think about that in terms of grappling with that, or winners and losers, right? We could have a setup where certain developers are building their wealth, and those who can afford to buy into the units they're making available are increasing their wealth. Some are left out, right? There's a lot of talk about small developers and land use changes and ways to try to chip away at that to find a medium. So final thoughts on balancing that: homes as a wealth building mechanism that's accessible to most people, fewest market failures, to Carlie's point, right? Small percentage, and that desire to, for those who are benefiting from the way things are now, how do we move forward with something for everyone? And that's my last question.
I think historical perspective on this, right? You have to recognize homeownership was the significant federal policy effort coming out of the Depression that built most of the wealth for the middle class in the United States, right? And it can be an incredibly effective wealth building mechanism. What we're not building, though, are those starter smaller homes for families to get into. And I'm a big proponent on homeownership, whether it's single family, multifamily, however you're doing it. It does create an embedded sense of security for folks, and you do have that wealth building opportunity. We have our community land trust program, which is great. That creates that opportunity for folks to do that, but other communities were doing that for decades, and we were very slow in that regard. So I think it's really about working within this system to make sure that we are being deliberate in creating those wealth building opportunities for folks who really could benefit the most from that. So again, it's always a balance, and the housing market's not necessarily a free market, right? We constrain it in so many ways, and so to recognize too that there's a policy side to that as well. Our policy decisions kind of decide who benefits and who doesn't benefit from the housing market. So it's really about using those policy tools we have that we can take advantage of, where homeownership and can help folks build wealth that could be intergenerational and transformative. We just need to make sure that we focus our policy on making sure that those folks reap the benefits of that.
I also think it's important to be a lot more transparent about how and why home ownership is a good investment. And it is not, in the abstract, a great financial investment. Home ownership, your investment there is going to appreciate 2, 3, maybe 4% a year. You take that same money you're spending and dump it into mutual funds, you're going to get a 10% annual return on investment. From a purely abstract financial standpoint, it makes a ton more money to go and invest in the S&P 500. The reason homeownership is a great investment is a lot more non-monetary. It's forced savings, for one. Because I'm telling you, if I'm renting, there is a part of me that is not putting $200, $300 a month into a savings account, but as a mortgage payer, I'm forced to do that, and I will. That's psychological. More than that, though, it's stability. I know my mortgage payment is my mortgage payment. I don't have to worry about being at the whims of a landlord. It's control. I can paint what I want. I can get the dog that I want. It is mine. It is neighborhood connection. I know I can never be booted from this community, and I can lay down roots here. Those are all fantastic upsides of home ownership, but they're not financial.
So I think to what Carlie said, unfortunately, some of that is becoming untrue, right? I can put my roots here and this is where I can stay as long as I, make my payments, but that's becoming more and more untrue as people are forced out of their communities because of rising property taxes, insurance, and lots of other things. We have tied this idea of wealth building in the United States to two things. One is real estate, and two is our 401k and what is there. The longitudinal wealth in our life is really based upon the performance of those two things. And so when we think about our property, I think a lot of people, their expectation is just that it can help them move to the next phase in their life, whether that's the house that's a little bit bigger or to the retirement community they want to live in. But what we're seeing now is that many of these starter homes that Jason mentioned have completely disappeared, are actually being bought by institutional investors. And those institutional investors are key companies that our 401ks are tied to and the public pension programs are tied to. And so there is a fear to take on these institutional investors and to stop their mispractices because of the impact it would have on pensions, on retirement, public retirement programs, and our own 401ks. So we're allowing our children's future to be stripped away so that we have a little bit more so that we can go live in the villages when we're 65. I think we really, as a community, just have to shift what our expectations are and who we're really living for today, that we're making the most of our lives and leaving a better world behind than what we were able to use while we were here.
And Jordan, I know we're going to get to a few questions, but whenever we talk about institutional investors, we don't include the second part of the conversation, is where are they acquiring those properties? They're not acquiring those properties in Upper Arlington. They're not acquiring those properties in New Albany or in Bexley. They are going to Black and brown neighborhoods and acquiring properties and also eliminating the wealth. Understanding, Carlie, your point about it, your return on investment is greater, but we also have to deal with tax deductions, your point about forced savings, the ability to tap into it and send a kid to college or start a business. And we are taking those institutional investors, they aren't taking housing away from people who live in Bexley. They're buying up housing in Linden.
Yeah.
And so again, let's also talk, let's be clear about who's being affected by the choices that we're making.
All right,
Sorry,
Jordan.
Jordan, I know you have some questions to take.
Jordan, I know you said we have several questions around density. Do you want to package that up for us there?
Sure. Yeah, and thanks to everybody who submitted questions. I think some of them have been touched upon in our speakers' comments already. We did receive several comments about density. An initial question, how do we educate the general public on the benefits of these multifamily options? And then other questions kind of relating to that about concerns about stressors to school system attendance and stressors about traffic or road construction in areas with increased density. So wonder if you could talk about how you all approach advocating for that and the conversations around that to change perceptions.
I mean, I think you start with, identifying where people are kind of tapped into outdated information. So there's a lot of folks who will think about housing or think about affordable housing. And when they have that picture in their mind, it's like 1950s style public housing. None of that is relevant anymore. We don't do that anymore.
No.
But I also would kind of confront the question itself a bit. And I'm kind of giving a sneak peek that I probably shouldn't at this point, but we just wrapped up a survey and we're building out, kind of analyzing what that looks like now, asking people, well, how do you feel about density? How do you feel about missing middle housing? How do you feel about building apartments on the transit corridors? 90-some% of people are all in favor. I can educate the bejesus out of that last 6-7%, but when 90-some% of people are saying, yes, do this, maybe we don't need to focus as much on education as we do on execution.
Mhm. And I could speak briefly to the school issue. This is a phenomenon known as fiscal zoning, very commonly practiced. So you have communities zoning to reach a certain price point, which is going to, produce X amount of school tax revenue for the district. I would argue too that that's an outdated idea as well. If you look at at least some of the analysis of tax generation from multifamily units, you'll find that actually, yeah, they do produce a fair amount of tax revenue. And if actually in the long term, communities that are zoned completely single family, they're going to have the highest property taxes for schools because that density, in particular commercial real estate, which is where mixed use comes in, is going to generate far more revenue. And there's also a statement here to be made too that this is a role for the state, right? So that's a school funding issue, which is, not necessarily just up to local governments. And so again, I think sometimes pretend that there are no solutions in this context when in reality other states, approach school funding very differently, and maybe are not dealing with this issue in the same way that we are.
And
I'd like
Jason,
to-
looks like you are gonna have to, sorry, Lark, I think we're at time.
Oh, wow.
So it looks like, go ahead. We'll take.
Well, I was just going to add in to Carlie's point about density and along corridors and where it makes sense. If we do that, then we can preserve green space. If we build density where there's already infrastructure, we can preserve some of our green space.
Very good. Thank you, Lark. It looks like you got the final word today.
wow.
I want to thank everyone on our panel so much. Everyone in attendance, thank you for joining another MORPC CURA webinar. And I'd be remiss if I didn't inform you that there's a new series coming up of CURA webinars next year. So be on the lookout for those. Plenty of exciting content. So again, thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for all that you do to move the region forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.